Okay, so hopefully you guys will be able to see the screen here. Hannah, chime in if you can't. Okay, great. Again, the atlas is just one of the things that we've done in the last 10 to 20 years with birds with the agency. It's probably the biggest thing, but really the importance of the atlas is as a conservation tool. And so as part of this presentation, I'm going to provide a little bit of background. Some of you guys are already familiar with the how we do our work and what guides our work, but I'm going to talk about the State Wildlife Action Plan, which is that guidance document. I'm going to talk about what a breeding bird atlas is. It's, it should be kind of intuitive, but at the same time, there's a lot of moving pieces to breeding bird atlases. I'm going to walk you through a tour of the book and give a narrative of what went into it and some of the statistics in terms of people that helped and all of that. And then I'm going to end up with the conservation value of the book. How can we actually use it beyond functioning as a desktop reference to actually guide conservation work? Because that's really what we're all about as an agency. We're here to protect the state's trust of wildlife, and in my case, that means birds. So going forward, wildlife action plans are a thing that have been around since 2005. And each plan period is 10 years, and every state is charged with developing one. One of the things that the plan allows is for state wildlife agencies to get federal funds to fund their work. And the plan is how we do that. It takes years to put one of these together, but the carrot is we then get funding to implement the work that the plan sets us out to do. So the first West Virginia Wildlife Action Plan was completed in 2005. And the second plan was completed in 2015. And the plan has taken an eco-region approach. There are many different ways to designate eco-regions and physiographic regions, but on the right, you can see the model that we used, which highlights the Allegheny Mountains, Allegheny Plateau, the Cumberland Mountains, and the Ridge and Valley. Wildlife action plans are centered around what we call species of greatest conservation need. And designation as a species of greatest conservation need can be because of a number of reasons. So if you look at this list, there are some species that seem like they're pretty common. Wood thrush would be an example of that, or bald eagle, which has had just an explosive population growth in the last 40 years in West Virginia. But nonetheless, there are reasons these species are on the planet, and that can range from, there's only one breeding occurrence in the state. You'll notice Mississippi kite on there. We now are happy to say we have kites breeding in the state at long last. There are examples where there's only one place a species breeds in the state. Right now, we're the southernmost outpost for olive-sided flycatcher in the state, and there's only one place in the state that we know that they nest, which is down at Cranberry Glades. But again, getting back to wood thrush, for example, the species is very common, but its population trajectory is very worrisome. And on top of that, West Virginia has very high population responsibility. 10% of all the wood thrushes on the planet breed in West Virginia during breeding season. And if you look at another bird, which is probably our poster bird in the state, cerulean warbler, that percentage is 35%. And so when you look at species like that, we really have a big conservation obligation. So you'll notice that some of these species names are bolded. Those are what we term priority species. And again, a species can be a priority for a number of reasons. It might be like long-eared owl, where we just don't know anything about them. We don't know their pattern of occurrence. We don't know the extent to which they breed in the state. It's very data poor, and we need to learn more. And again, it just goes from there. But these lists of species guide our work, and our work is centered around what we call conservation threats and actions. So for every species or group of species, we want to identify what are the threats, what are causing these species to decline, and we want to think carefully about what sorts of conservation actions we can implement to protect them. And in West Virginia, and this is kind of the case in the Appalachian Mountains as a whole, and honestly, probably much of the eastern United States. There are three groups of species in particular that are declining. The first is birds of grasslands, and no group of birds is declining faster and more steeply than grassland birds. But again, if you look at birds of early successional forest and shrublands and old field habitats, obviously golden wing warbler comes to mind, but ruffed grouse and bobwhite quail, which are now functionally extirpated from West Virginia, these species have also been experiencing chronic declines. And then you look at birds of forest interior, species like, again, cerulean warbler and Kentucky warbler and worm-eating warbler and Swainson's warbler. Unlike grassland birds, for example, forest songbirds are not declining across the board. But what the big deal is, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains and definitely in West Virginia, is that we just have a high population responsibility, as I mentioned before. And there are a lot of threats that are facing these songbirds, from forest fragmentation from various causes to threats on their wintering grounds, to any number of threats specific to individual species. And so conservation action plan lays out options and things to consider when we're looking to conserve these species. And so if you look further in the plan, we've also taken a spatial approach that dives deeper than the ecoregion approach, and we've actually designated conservation focus areas in the state. And these conservation focus areas are designated based not just on terrestrial taxa, but also on aquatic taxa as well. And some of these will leap out as pretty obvious to you. For example, 16 there, the high Alleghenies. Obviously, we have a special interest in our high elevation forests. If you look at number 8, which is the Greenbrier watershed, it just has a phenomenal bird diversity as far as West Virginia is concerned, and it just goes from there. But this is designed to help us further refine where we work, given that we have limited capacity, we don't have the staff that we would like to have, and we don't have the money that we would like to have. So where will we get the best bang for our buck in terms of where we work? And so this is our best stab at it. And again, maps like this and lists like the species of greatest conservation need are mutable things. And as each wildlife action plan comes up and gets revised, we're actually about to go into the planning period for the 2025 plan. These things are all subject to change and refinement. And so we fully expect that the species of greatest conservation need list will change. For example, we might tweak this conservation focus area map. You know, again, situation changes on the ground over time. So as part of the first wildlife action plan, really the thrust of that plan was gathering information data pertaining to species occurrence, and not just birds, but across all taxa. We found that even though we'd been working for years to collect what we call element occurrences in terms of patterns of species, where they are and how many of them there are, we really were still data deficient. And the big project, the big charge for birds for the first state wildlife action plan was the completion of the second breeding bird atlas. So in that mix, before I dive into our atlases specifically, I just want to give an overview of what a bird atlas is. And on here, you can see covers of a whole bunch of other atlas projects that have been completed that we're following on the coattails of in some circumstances. But at their core, they're systematic and comprehensive grid-based randomized surveys of a given geography. A breeding bird survey doesn't necessarily need to be just at state scale. It can be at a county scale. There are county breeding bird atlases. It can be at any particular scale, but most of them are conducted at the state or provincial scale. And so they're organized around this grid, and we call them atlas blocks. In different states and provinces, blocks might be different size or based on different grids. But for ours, our blocks were based on the USGS topographic 7.5-minute quadrangle maps. And there were 6 blocks per one of those quadrangles. But again, the main thrust is to collect breeding evidence for as many species as possible over a period averaging 5 years. Our atlas was 6 years, and I'll get into that. But it's always a consistent time period over which field work is conducted. And again, the heart of it is to document the occurrence find as many birds as you can. It's just a colossal scavenger hunt, but there's a lot more that goes into it. We want to estimate occurrence. We want to take a look at change in occurrence in birds. If you have a second atlas or later, you have the ability to measure how bird occurrence has changed over time between atlas periods. And this is one of the greatest functionalities of an atlas, is being able to say, well, this species increased, this species decreased. We can track what's happening. We can correlate what's happening to other things that are happening on the landscape. And if you really have a lot of resources, you can estimate population density, which I'll also get to in a minute. But again, these are repeated at regular intervals, and those intervals average about 20 years or so. So the first West Virginia breeding bird atlas was completed 1984 to 1989. There are people on this call that gave greatly of their time for that first project. Jay Buckaloo and George Hall, definitely luminaries in the West Virginia bird community, were coordinators of that project. As a lot of first atlases go, the main thrust was to collect presence-absence data and breeding evidence for as many species as possible. And they did a great job of it. That project was, again, over 6 years, and the first atlas guided conservation work at all kinds of scales, even up until the beginning of the second atlas. And it's amazing how many different ways this book helped us in terms of identifying project goals in terms of bird conservation. So the second bird atlas, which is now published, takes what was done with the first breeding bird atlas and expands it considerably. The field period for the second atlas was 2009 to 2014. So again, the field period fell completely within the first state wildlife action plan period, although obviously the subsequent five or 6 years working on the book took up half of the next plan. But we logged over 100,000 bird observations, and we conducted more than 2,000 point count surveys that would enable us to estimate population density. We had well over 100 volunteers, worked tirelessly for thousands of hours. I have a lot of gratitude to a lot of birders in the state who went to places that no one usually birds, and definitely are not necessarily the most enjoyable place to bird, to collect the kind of data that we needed to really put this together. There's a lot of joy in atlasing. I spent so many hours in the field, and some of the best birding that I was able to experience in my life happened in places that really not a lot of birders go in this state. I spent a lot of time in the coal fields, and I found a lot of interesting birds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk you through the chapters of the book and just give you a sense of how this book is organized and why we did it, and the sorts of content that the book includes, you know, as a preface to going over briefly some of the results and all of that. So obviously, at the beginning of the book, we wanted to present some context for the rest of the book. So in addition to typical introductory content and acknowledging the efforts of our many volunteers, we wrote a chapter on geography that really focused on information that would provide context for the later content in the book. Things like elevation and weather and how climate changed between the atlas periods, and describing the state's ecoregions and their characteristics and what types of birds might occur where, just simply based on physiography. All that sort of stuff we included in these introductory chapters. And following that, we got into taking a look at habitats in West Virginia with a particular eye to how habitats have changed. Again, one of the things that we wanted to provide context for is how things changed between atlas periods. So in other words, the first atlas collected a ton of data about birds. We collected a ton of data about birds, but some of those changes might be explained by some of the things that's happened on the landscape. Have areas gained or lost forest cover? Has forest fragmentation increased? Are there areas where residential and urban development has penetrated? Are there areas where grasslands have succeeded through to be old fields and later into forests? All these sorts of things we wanted to get at. On the bottom left, you can see what we call the terrestrial habitat map. This map is the core habitat map that we used for the State Wildlife Action Plan, but it highlights what we we decided at least were the most important habitat groups for the state. And obviously, kind of in the heart of the mountains, you can see the high elevation forest, but elsewhere, just the extent of forest cover in the state, for example. But again, on the right, you can look and say we developed maps that highlight forest cover in the state, and then we took a look at how that forest cover has changed. And at the bottom map, you can see how forest cover has declined in the coal fields. But if you look in the Allegheny Plateau, those western hill counties, there's a lot of blue there that's still kind of a leftover signal for all the farmland abandonment that happened in those counties many years ago. So there's still things that we were seeing, still things that were happening between the two atlases that might inform our conclusions about why bird occurrence changed in certain ways. From there, we went into the actual methodology of how we completed the atlas. This has everything to do with our field work and how we conducted it, and again, how atlas blocks were arranged and how we targeted our work in atlas blocks. On the right, you can see there's a map of all the locations that we conducted point count surveys. In red are the point counts that we completed as a part of atlas work, and the other colors are all these other point counts that we imported from academic work and other conservation efforts. And taken as a whole, those point counts were instrumental in enabling us to develop maps that highlight population density, which is just really, really useful. There are all sorts of neat products that are being produced by bird organizations these days. These might be akin to the amazing maps that eBird and Cornell are producing now based on eBird data, taking a look at abundance and how abundance changes over the annual cycle for birds. I would say that our map is perhaps a slightly finer resolution, but again, it accomplishes the same thing. It highlights where the most birds are and where we might target our conservation work. We dedicate a chapter to highlighting the math behind what we did. How did we develop our occurrence estimates and our change estimates and our density models? A lot of that was developed by Andy Wilson, who is a professor at Gettysburg College. He was an editor to the Pennsylvania's Second Atlas and guided their work, and then he served as an advisor, a statistician to the Ohio Breeding Bird Atlas and to us. And we owe him a huge debt of gratitude for developing the methodology that we then use to develop a lot of the map products in our book. He's just a fantastic human being. So again, just covers the math, and from there we launch into taking a look at the summary of the results. The heart of a breeding bird atlas are the species accounts, of course, but this chapter summarizes some of the bigger takeaways from taking a look at how effort was distributed across the state. In other words, birders like to bird in certain places, and if you look at this map of effort, you can see that a lot of people love to spend time in the mountain counties. I don't blame them, I do too. But it helps us take a look at where, if effort is lower in one place and higher in another, it might alter our conclusions in terms of whether bird occurrence may have increased or decreased. Maybe we're seeing signals of too much effort or too little effort. On the right, you can see a couple tables that highlight how species occurrence changed between atlases, both in terms of gain and loss. On the top is gain. Unsurprisingly, species like tree swallow and Canada goose, which have increased robustly, top the list. If you take a look at magnolia warbler, for example, BBS data indicate that magnolia warbler population quintupled between atlas periods. They're doing really well. But on the flip, there are quite a few species that are really not faring well in the state. In red are species that are data deficient. So red is kind of the caveat for that. But if you take a look at golden wing warbler for there at the top, it's really no surprise that tops the list of species where we have great data, and nonetheless they just declined catastrophically in the state, as has vesper sparrow and ruffed grouse and broad-winged hawk. Some of these species we might be surprised have declined as badly as they have, and those declines have occurred for quite a few reasons, some of which we can point fingers at, and other reasons are just not clearly elucidated. It's difficult for us to make conclusions. But nonetheless, this is really useful stuff. It helps us guide our work. What species belong on that species of greatest conservation need list? This really helps us narrow that list down. There are a whole host of other whole host of more information in that chapter that gets at how things change and summarizes the results of the project. So going into the heart of the Breeding Bird Atlas, and most of the book are the species accounts. We were able to document what we felt was compelling breeding evidence for 170 species, as well as 2 hybrids. Those are vermivora hybrids between blue-wing and golden-winged warblers. 170 species is not too shabby. And for every species, we did quite a bit of exhaustive research on writing up their species accounts. And we did our very best to organize these in a way to where you can use them as a quick reference to find really data-rich content to help in any number of different ways. So cerulean warbler, again, I depicted here because it's our poster bird. If you look at these 4 maps, it ranges from breeding evidence, which is basically you can look at that as the raw data, to estimated occurrence, where we took that raw data and used statistical methods to fill in the blanks. And it really, when you do that, it really highlights the core cerulean warbler range in the state. We also took a look at estimating change. How has cerulean warbler occurrence changed between atlas periods? There's this notion that cerulean warblers are just categorically declining and it's just bad news. And in general, they have declined pretty bad. But if you look at the their picture in West Virginia, as with a lot of species, it's pretty complex. It's not just a cut and dry thing. There are areas where cerulean warblers have clearly declined, but there are areas where they have increased their occurrence, particularly in the central and northern Allegheny Mountains. In the smoke hole region, for example, there are definitely signals that cerulean warbler has increased. And at the bottom right is that density map that I've been alluding to already. And you can look at it as a heat map. It's not just where cerulean warblers occur in the state, it's where are the highest population densities. And this map really pulls out the importance of certain areas of the state. And by the way, if you look at this pattern of occurrence, if you look at the estimated occurrence map for cerulean warbler, and you see that pattern of dark blue there, I want you to remember that pattern because I'm going to show it to you again a little bit later. But you can see that pattern as well kind of leap out at you when you look at it closely in that estimated density map. But in those central northern Allegheny Plateau counties, we clearly have a lot of cerulean warblers breeding. Those areas are overwhelmingly under private land ownership. They're vulnerable to shale gas development and fragmentation. And when you take a look at West Virginia's population responsibility, it definitely lends urgency to where we should direct our work to try to protect the species. So moving on from species accounts, we rounded out the book with a long chapter on bird conservation in West Virginia. We provided some context by going over how bird conservation is done at the national and regional scales. But this chapter goes through and summarizes some of the bigger threats to birds in West Virginia. Again, things like forest fragmentation and energy development, threats to aerial insectivores, invasive species, all these other things that we tend to think about when we come up with lists of things that affect birds. It gives an overview of protected lands in the state and other such things. We spent a lot of time trying to narrow down some of the bigger threats to birds and providing some concise summaries for them. So it's a chapter we're pretty proud of. So we also, at the end of the book, there's a ton of appendices that cover lots of ground, from tables documenting some of the raw data in terms of block occurrence, to statistics on change in occurrence, to depicting raw data and from the first atlas and second atlas, and that's what this is a map of. This is that cerulean warbler map again, just depicting raw data from the first and second atlas. We had a pretty big difficulty in terms of comparing change between the second atlas and the first atlas, because unfortunately, all of the effort data that was compiled for the first atlas were lost, and we don't know where it went, and we didn't have access to it. So because of that, we couldn't take a look at patterns of effort, and we could not make direct comparisons of gain or loss at the block level. That's why we developed statistical methods to estimate change instead, using comparisons of occupancy models. But this is the raw data. We wanted to include it nonetheless with those caveats. And so in the back of the second breeding bird atlas is all of the data from the first breeding bird atlas, at least in terms of their species, breeding evidence maps. We also took a look at our point count data and pulled out statistics from point counts that enable us to derive associations with elevation and forest cover and different habitat types. Again, this can be really useful if you look at elevation, for example. It's pretty clear that there's an elevational range in West Virginia where cerulean warblers occur. Above a certain elevation, they're highly unlikely to occur, and they peak at low to mid elevations, again, where you would expect in oak dominated or hickory dominated deciduous forests. If you look at this photograph here, this is Boone County and what is great cerulean warbler habitat. If you get up on ridges in Boone County, you're going to hear a lot of cerulean warblers. But again, point counts enabled us to derive these graphs for quite a few species, over 100, and it just helps highlight the habitats they use and some of their habitat preferences. So rounding things out in terms of where we are with this project, I've kept this slide for a long time as I've ticked off the items up above, from cleaning the atlas data sets, which took a long time, to working through drafts after drafts of maps and graphs and tables, and developing style and content guidelines for the book, and raising funds. We have a deep debt of gratitude to the Brooks Bird Club for donating $20,000 to help us subsidize the price of the book. It went through exhaustive editing and peer review. We worked with state photographers to get great pictures, all of that work, and then ended with the book going on sale this June, and it was a big moment for us, and to say the least. So going forward, we're looking at how to develop a web presence for the book, in addition to it being in a print volume. Penn State University Press was kind enough to be our publisher. They've also published the Ohio and Pennsylvania atlases. They're also working to publish the Wisconsin atlas presently. So they are definitely experienced now at publishing bird atlas books. By the way, we're in the developing stages of a butterfly atlas for West Virginia under the guidance of Sue Olcott, and we're hoping that we might be able to publish that book through PSU Press as well. In any case, I have about 8 years of bliss before I have to start planning work for the third atlas, which is slated to begin in 2034. There's a lot that I'm thinking about in terms of getting that project done, but it's daunting at the same time. So some takeaways here from the atlas. I'm just going to show you several slides that highlight some of the things that we've seen, some of the signals we saw in atlas data, and what types of conclusions we might to draw from it. Across the board, as I mentioned, grassland species and early successional forest species are declining. It's happening in West Virginia, it's happening elsewhere. There are exceptions to that rule. If you take a look at grassland bird species, unlike a lot of other places, bobolinks are increasing robustly in West Virginia, and they are definitely bucking the trend, but we're one of the only places where bobolinks are increasing. But again, if you look at grassland birds that are common, take a look at eastern meadowlark. On the left is the change map. It's a pattern that you might expect to see in areas where forests have continued to mature and recover from 20th century logging and agriculture. You can see that signal is still in play even between atlases in terms of decline and occurrence. But if you look at the southwest coal fields, as you might expect, with the rapid increase in reclaimed minelands, we've seen a large increase in eastern meadowlark presence down there. Again, it's not cut and dry, admitting someone here. Okay, if you take a look at yellow-breasted chat, which occupies early successional habitats and shrubby areas, again, chats have experienced a catastrophic decline in the state leading into the first atlas. And even between the first atlas and the second atlas, they lost more than half of their population again in West Virginia. And there's probably nowhere in West Virginia where yellow-breasted chats have increased in occurrence. It's a grim tale, and it plays out with other species to varying degrees. If you take a look at field sparrow, which has declined, I'll do that in the next slide. But if you look at Vesper sparrow is all but gone in West Virginia now as a breeder. There's still a few, but not many. It kind of tells the same tale. And again, a lot of that is just a habitat signal. We've lost a ton of early successional habitat in West Virginia, and our grasslands have been lost in a lot of the states as well, particularly in Eastern Panhandle. If you look at Jefferson and Berkeley counties, where there used to be a lot of pastures, there's now a lot of housing developments and row crops, and so there's not a lot of opportunities for grassland birds to exist there. That's one of the biggest reasons why loggerhead shrikes used to exist over there, and they no longer do, at least in any kind of meaningful way. Okay, there we go. Okay, but the situation is complicated, and just taking a look at occurrence maps or breeding bird survey graphs, I should have said on the right, or breeding bird survey graphs, it is complicated. So if you take a look at field sparrow, for example, there's a familiar decline there, where field sparrows have experienced a chronic decline in West Virginia to the point where they're on our wildlife action plan. But if you look at their change in occurrence, there's not really a huge signal that they've changed in occurrence. And it just highlights the fact that birds can remain ubiquitous, but nonetheless lose substantial percentages of their populations before a change in occurrence in terms of presence, across the state becomes apparent. If you take a look at wood thrush, for example, it's still ubiquitous across the state, but it's lost 60% of its population. And I strongly suspect that unless the situation changes, we are going to start seeing range withdrawal, perhaps a downslope movement in the Allegheny Mountains by the next atlas. But that's just speculation, and there are things in play like climate change that really kind of mess with everything. All right, bidding someone else. Okay. So if you look at, sorry, I want to go back. So if you look at blue-winged warbler, for example, blue-winged warbler is rapidly expanding its presence in the state. And if you look at in the change map there, you can see that there's a clear upslope movement that has occurred with blue-winged warblers. They've been increasing along a front as they move upslope to the detriment of golden-winged warblers. But nonetheless, if you look at their state breeding bird survey graph, the situation is not, does not seem to compute with their increase in occurrence in the state. And again, that's just because they're gaining in some places doesn't mean there aren't chronic losses occurring elsewhere. If you look at forest songbirds, for example, some birds are just holding their own and holding steady and just remain ubiquitous and common everywhere. If you take a look at red-eyed vireo, that change map's pretty white. The whiter the change map, the fewer shaders there are on that map, the less change may have occurred. And in this case, there's no significant change for red-eyed vireo. The species was statewide before, it's still statewide. If you look at the breeding bird survey graph, for example, the trend, statistically speaking, is not significant or not credible. That's not to say it won't change in the future, but some species are holding their own. And sometimes the news is quite good. If you look at ovenbird, for example, sorry, I'm going to someone else now. Okay, if you look at ovenbird, for example, generally speaking, the species occurrence increased in the state. And if you look at the breeding bird survey trend, there's definitely some good data that we have quite a few more ovenbirds in the state than we did during the first atlas. And the same would go for a number of other species like blue-headed vireo, black-throated green warbler. There are quite a few others that have experienced increases in the context that perhaps more species have declined. So the picture with forests, though, is complex. So there are certainly species that we might call forest generalists, like red-eyed vireo and scarlet tanager, where they, or ovenbird, where they occur in a large number of forest types across the state. But if you take a closer look at species that themselves are forest birds, but rely on forests other than even-aged closed canopy forests, which now predominate in much of the state, you can see that there have been declines. So for example, even though we have, 78% of the state is forested, quite a bit of that forest is not terribly hospitable to a number of species. So if you take a look at Kentucky warbler, for example, again, a species that has experienced chronic long-term declines, and the picture did not change between atlases, and there's a lot of concern about Kentucky warbler. Kentucky warbler and cerulean warbler often occur in tandem, with cerulean warblers in the overstory and Kentucky warblers in the understory. And I want to show you something, and you take a look at the arrows. Remember, I pointed out that pattern of occurrence for cerulean warbler, and you can kind of see this area of white here, which ostensibly forms the heart of cerulean warbler occurrence in the state. There was no change. They held their own there. And look, if you take a look at Kentucky warbler, you see this pattern here. This pattern remains, and it's a pretty compelling one. And what that highlights is an area that is really of high conservation value to these forest birds. There's a lot going on in those areas, but there's something about that north to south stretch of forest that is really important to these birds, and where they have still held their own, regardless of other factors. But again, in the context of declines, really when we look to guide our conservation work, that area is where we're looking for both of those species. There is some good news. There's quite a bit of good news, but sometimes that good news can be too good. On the top, you have yellow-throated warbler, which has been increasing steadily to the point now where West Virginia has an estimated 10% of the global yellow-throated warbler population. The species is of conservation concern in the southeast. But here in West Virginia, the species has been increasing quite rapidly. If you look at this zone of expansion here, there's been an upslope expansion. This looks almost identical to the upslope expansion experienced by blue-winged warbler. They're moving into higher elevations. In general, they've increased quite a bit. Their population is quite large compared to where it was in the first atlas. And the reasons for that are unknown. I suspect there's changes in forest conditions, there's climate change, there's any number of things that we could take a look at, but that's one that's increased quite a bit. If you take a look at black vulture down below, black vultures have increased remarkably between atlases. They're not detected well by the Breeding Bird Survey because they don't vocalize, and you're just not, vultures are not well detected by BBS routes. But nonetheless, they're getting abundant to the point now where we're running into conflict issues with them. Before 1930, we didn't have black vultures in the state. There were no records. And so black vultures are new in the last century in West Virginia, and they just have continued to increase. So there's some interesting things that happen. Other species that have increased robustly would be common raven. Again, I already said magnolia warbler, black-throated green warbler, and there's a host of other species have increased as well. Yellow-rumped warbler, for example, has just exploded, and yellow-rumped warblers are now breeding in pine habitats at lower elevations just east of Marlinton. And to the extent that they continue to occupy pine habitats over there, I'm definitely interested to see. So one of the points of the atlas, the whole point of the atlas really, aside from providing folks with a good desktop reference, is guiding conservation work. So I just want to highlight, that we are doing work in partnership with other agencies and organizations to guide forest management in particular on private lands. That's our biggest conservation priority, and cerulean warbler is our biggest conservation priority bird. And so what that means is we're trying to cut trees, and we're trying to cut a lot of them. And a lot of times that's synonymous with oh my gosh, why are you doing that? But again, we have real issues with forest structure in the state, and the types of management that we do for cerulean warbler and golden-winged warbler, for example, creates structure that benefits a whole suite of species. There's a lot of good data now, for example, that suggests that songbirds that breed in mature forests like wood thrush, post-fledging and post-breeding dispersal, they go into early successional habitats and young forest habitats before they begin their fall migration south. And so there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of farm bill dollars that are available to improve habitat on private lands. And going forward for the foreseeable future, habitat delivery is really what we're all about. And we're supervising biologists, and we're partnering in all kinds of ways to get that done. We have, thanks to Peacher Wood and other PIs and other universities, we've developed some really great management practices for cerulean warbler and those documents are guiding the work that we're doing on private lands. Our goal is to get 12,500 acres across 3 states implemented in the next few years. We might have even already met that goal, actually. We have 2 going on 3 partner biologists that are working on projects here in West Virginia. And again, it's all about partnership in terms of us and NRCS and these other agencies to get this work done. If you take a look at the Central Appalachians, the red outline there is the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture. We've also outlined priority areas for cerulean warbler in the region. And again, you can see where we're guiding our work in West Virginia. If you take a look at how Atlas products have guided development of these maps, you can take a look at the estimated occupancy map in the upper left, and you can take a look how it fed directly into our priority counties where we're targeting federal farm bill dollars to incentivize private landowners to manage their forest for cerulean warblers. Forest management is increasingly important to us, and we've got a number of really big grants ongoing right now that are tackling different angles of this problem to improve forest structure for forest birds. Again, when you help cerulean warbler, for example, guess what's showing up in the understory? You're getting grouse and Kentucky warbler and hooded warblers and a whole suite of other species. So I'm just going to round things out by making a plea that I always make, that we are understaffed and underfunded, and there's way more work than we can accomplish ourselves. And because of that, we absolutely rely on birders and bird enthusiasts for all sorts of things. That can be things that have already been mentioned, you all know about, like Christmas bird counts. That data feeds right into some pretty useful products in terms of tracking non-breeding season occurrence for birds. We always need help with Christmas bird counts. The Morgantown count is well staffed every year. But I would make a plea to you guys to consider traveling to some counts that really struggle. For example, I compile the Pocahontas Christmas bird count, which just has absolutely fantastic birds, and we struggle to get, every year we struggle to get the territories filled. Or help Fred Atwood in Pendleton County with that count, any number of these other ones that are under visited. Or consider starting a new Christmas bird count. If you notice, there are quite a few opportunities in West Virginia to start a new Christmas bird count. All of you, or most of you, are bird enthusiasts, and I suspect that most of you are using eBird. But if I would make any kind of pitch, I would make the pitch to submit wherever possible your observations to eBird. I sound like an advertisement, but not only does it manage your bird lists, it plugs directly into science, and the products that eBird and Cornell are producing are just amazing these days. And knowingly or unknowingly, birders across the world now are submitting data that are getting used to make some pretty big decisions about how we're working to protect birds. So if you're not using eBird, it's super easy to use. I just can't recommend it enough. Finally, I coordinate the state breeding bird survey, and this is a singular tool started by Chan Robbins many years ago to do annual bird surveys to track changes in bird populations. The breeding bird survey is great for songbirds. It's not so great for other species that don't sing, but nonetheless, it's one of the best and most enduring tools we have for tracking bird occurrence. And I struggle every year to fill the routes in West Virginia. I have folks that will come and help for a year or two, and then they'll move on to other things. I understand breeding bird survey routes are very intense. It's a labor of love, but it is some fast-paced birding, and you can find all kinds of interesting things that you just didn't expect, and it takes you to places you would never otherwise go birding. We just like we hear a lot. Demographics in West Virginia are not, there are not as many young people as we would like in the state, and so I very badly need young ears to help with breeding bird survey routes. And if anyone might be enticed to help out, please just let me know, and I can talk with you more about it. And finally, we do all sorts of surveys and monitoring for special projects and things like that. We monitor the state's bald eagle nests every year. We still do it, even though bald eagles have increased by insane margins over the last 40 years. There's a lot of regulatory issues surrounding eagles, particularly things like wind facilities. So it's incumbent on us to check these nests and make sure they're active, or to document new nests. So, you know, I'm always looking for help finding nests or documenting whether nests are active. There are folks on this call that help me with that, and I am grateful for your help. I have a minor loggerhead shrike obsession. For the remaining 30 pairs or so that are in the state. I know them all by name probably, but I'm definitely, if anyone spends time down in the Greenbrier Valley, I definitely could use conscientious birders to help monitor shrikes. The bonus is I can put a shrike on your list for the year. We do work with barn owls and habitat work, installing nest boxes. You know, we'll check on species that have very limited occurrence in the state, like northern harrier. I always hold out hope that upland sandpipers still continue to breed in the state, but you know, I think that might be naive. There's a laundry list, and there are things that are happening in new species that are on the horizon this year. For example, we got our first compelling evidence of possible sandhill crane breeding in the state. And we're going to follow up on that next year. One of the eminent botanizers and wetland scientists in the state, Elizabeth Byers, was doing work way off trail in the hinterlands of Canaan Valley Refuge and flushed a pair of cranes in early June. They were clearly a pair, but they weren't able to follow up and take a look at whether there was an active nest. We're going to go back and try to suss it out. But anytime now, we're expecting sandhill crane breeding. Might have already been happening. So there's just lots of interesting things happening with birds, and there always needs to we always have needs to monitor and survey birds. And so that's all I've got. I guess Hannah, can you tell me how to hand it back to you? And I can answer. We can have whatever conversation you'd like to have.
Okay, great. I went ahead and reclaimed as the host.
Okay.
So yeah, so awesome. Thank you, Rich. That was a really cool presentation. I know.
Sorry, I went a little long. I apologize about that.
Oh no, you're good. If anyone else is like me, they have questions. So just a reminder about how to ask those questions. You can either write it in the chat box and I can read it out, or you can write in the chat box that you would like to ask a question yourself, and then I will invite you to unmute. So if you have any questions, ask away. I had a minor question. So if you buy the atlas, where do the proceeds go? Like, is it just to the DNR?
So I'm holding the book right now. You can't really see it because my thing isn't working. Here, thank you, Katie. So the way it worked was Brooks Bird Club donated money, and we donated money, and we had a contract with Penn State University Press, and basically for them to break even on their investment in the book, we get no money from it. It is actually, it's basically, we publish it as a service to state residents. We actually paid into a pot. Again, I said Brooks Bird Club donated 20,000. We put in 20,000 as well, which brought the price down to a manageable 65, 70 bucks, which is the standard price for such books. Other than that, Penn State Press will recoup whatever money they can from book sales. As part of that agreement, they're fantastic to work with, but they actually did all of the design and layout work and copy edit. They did a lot of copy editing. So they're basically accepting the financial risk of, what if the book doesn't sell? I mean, it's selling. We're happy about that. But so basically that's a model that is pretty much the case with every book like this that's produced.
Does anyone else have questions?
Katie?
Oh, let me unmute you. Where are you? Let's see. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Rich. That was great. It's a beautiful book. If you don't have one already, it's really, really neat. I've only just started to look through it, and it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Can you mention some of those areas that you mentioned? A couple of them in the presentation, but a few areas that need more birders?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you look at the demographics of the state, there are probably 0 birders that are regularly doing any kind of birding down in the southwestern counties. Part of that is understandable. There's a lot of stigma attached to the coal fields, and the way that it's talked about for people that have not been there before, it's easy to conjure up an image of just utter devastation as far as the eye can see, but that's not the case. There's a lot of beautiful land down there, and it's just filled with great forest songbirds and summer tanagers and Swainson's warblers and all kinds of neat birds. And there's actually quite a bit of public land down there that you can go bird. So I mean, if we needed, we often get no reports from Mingo or Boone or Logan counties. We get very few from Lincoln County, from Wayne County, away from the Ohio River. There's just whole quarters of the state that are just not visited and not birded. If you look at counties in the central Allegheny Plateau, like Calhoun County or Wirt County, kind of these other Ohio Hills counties, again, they're on the way to nowhere, so to speak, and there's not a ton of public land, and therefore we don't receive a lot of reports. But nonetheless, when we did atlasing, I'm here to say the birding is great. Some of those, like Calhoun County, is the heart of cerulean occurrence in the state, probably. And if you get in the right places, it can be the most common songbird in the woods. If you even if you take a look at the southwestern coal fields, when you get up on some of those reclaimed minelands, there are public lands that include reclaimed minelands. The grasshopper sparrow abundance is just off the charts. I mean, it's unbelievable how many grasshopper sparrows are down there. There's blue grosbeaks, there's horned larks. I mean, it's not just a cut and dry thing. And there is a long-standing birding enigma that has yet to be answered. Actually, there's 2, and I can level these as challenges to you guys. The first one is that we have long suspected that common nighthawks breed down on reclaimed minelands in the coal fields, and we have yet to confirm breeding or document their presence. The habitat is there; it's absolutely quite likely that they're there. We just haven't been able to be there to do it. The other is that about 20 years ago, one of Petra's students came across breeding season short-eared owls down on a couple of mine reclaims down there, and we never went back. We never confirmed it or monitored it. but there's also a reasonable chance that there could be short-eared owls down on these minery plains as well. Kind of how I believe they're at the wilds in Ohio. Am I right about that? I know that they occur there in winter. In any case, there's a lot of interesting things going on. And so I definitely invite people to go down and bird.
It's like Mountaineer Audubon road trip.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you.
Rich, we have a couple of questions about where can you purchase a copy of the atlas? Is it at the PSU website? And should we be buying directly from PSU, or like, is Amazon not a good?
So it's on, I'm posting the link in the website, I mean, in the chat. So there's, oh, thanks. Someone, Nary already beat me to it.
Okay.
I encourage folks to purchase directly from PSU. That gives them the most money, frankly. They did a great service to us, but yes, you can purchase at Barnes & Noble online or on Amazon online if you want to do it that way. I will also say that, and I'm sorry, Mountaineer Audubon guys, but because of their donation, if you're a member of the Brooks Bird Club and you have not bought a book already, you are entitled to a discount. That was part of the agreement for the donation that they provided. So just send me a message or an email and I can provide you the code for that, and you can get a discounted copy of the book.
And then we have a question. So you describe changes in environments such as grasslands going through succession to forest due to abandoned farmlands. What about the fact of invasive species? So this person says that she knows that birds eat the Tartaric honeysuckle, but others such as Asian stiltgrass are taking over large areas and affecting availability of insects and seeds that the birds use as part of their food chain. So are these factors being considered as an influence on bird populations?
So the short answer is absolutely. Yes, that is the case, but it's incredibly complicated, and incidents of invasive species obviously it changes across the landscape. There are many different invasive plant species. Birds use or avoid them in different ways. And so just depending on where you are and what the invasive plant community is, you might have birds avoiding it, or those infestations serving as population sinks, where they may have poor breeding success because of any number of factors. But sometimes it's pretty weird. If, for example, if you take a look at Swainson's warbler, for example, I flushed him out of the nastiest knotweed thickets you could find at the entrance of coal mines down in Boone County. And they love knotweed. They love infestations of multiflora rose from old fields under a canopy. And again, if you think about what Swainson's warbler prefers in terms of understory structure and leaf litter, that might work for them. But then, you know, there are other examples of that. Like if you take a look at autumn olive, which is an absolute scourge on farmland and field edges, particularly in the Greenbrier Valley, golden wing warblers use autumn olive extensively in terms of the habitat that they nest in. And when we do conservation work to improve habitat for golden wing warbler, we're faced with the dilemma of leaving autumn olive because it's the only structure that the golden wing warblers might use. We could remove the autumn olive, but then we're faced with the work of planting a whole bunch of native plants and a lot more cost in response. So it's really complicated, but then there are species that are just bad and there's no good about them. And Japanese stilt grass is definitely one of those things. Obviously they affect, or garlic, mustard, these things that alter the forest understory. And oftentimes there are synergistic effects between invasive species and not just humans, but also white-tailed deer, for example. If I were to point a finger at one of the biggest perpetrators of understory forest habitat degradation, I'd take a look at deer, particularly on the margins of residential areas and fragmented landscapes, for example. So the short answer is yes, there is a large meta study of bird papers and response to invasive species that was published a year or two ago, I believe. But basically the gist was the overall opinion was equivocal. In other words, invasive species haven't been categorically bad for birds and they haven't been categorically good. You really just have to look at the specific circumstances. you have to really think carefully if you're removing invasive multiflora rose in an understory or something like that. You have to be extremely careful about doing it because if you remove it, there's species like Japanese stilt grass which thrive on disturbed soils, and they will, and Japanese stilt grass will just move right in after the multiflora rose. So you have to really think carefully about it. I don't have a strong opinion about invasive species in terms of whether they're bad or good either. I mean, the data suggests that we want to avoid things like bush honeysuckle. You mentioned bush honeysuckle. It seems like in certain circumstances, bush honeysuckles can serve as habitat sinks for certain species like northern cardinals, for example. But it's not a cut and dry thing.
Cool.
Sorry, that was a lot of talking for a lack of a clear answer. I apologize about that.
I thought that was a good answer. Does anyone else have any questions before we end the meeting? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so, oh, Nari, let me unmute you. Let's see. Okay, you should be good.
Okay, hi everybody. If I've added most of the remaining people that I had emails for, okay, my name is Nari Soundarajan, and I'm the Vice President for the Mountaineer Audubon chapter. And most of you might have seen the email, the initial addition email to the information news list that we sent out. And if you have not received that, please do also check your spam folder. That's because when I tested it, some of them went to my spam folder and on my test emails. But other than that, if you still don't find it, I'm going to share a link here that you might be able to just go here and then request to be added to the email list.
And just a reminder that the email list is for members, official members. So we welcome anyone who wants to be a new member, and then you'll be able to be added to our email list.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Nari. All right, well, I didn't see any other questions. So thank you again, Rich. That was an awesome presentation. I'm really glad that you were able to give it, and we appreciate your time and expertise. And then that's the conclusion of our meeting. Please come again next month, the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. So stay tuned. I'll send out an announcement on email and Facebook like I did for this. So thanks, everyone.